He wandered the zoo pathways aimlessly, hoping a walk among the animals might clear his mind. Lately, everything felt strange between him and Alira, his alien lover. Their relationship had always been unusual, with her boundless curiosity and her way of connecting with creatures that he often found perplexing. But recently, something had shifted. There was a distance in her gaze, a kind of detachment that he couldn't quite place, and it left him feeling hollow, like he was slowly losing her to some invisible force. He had almost finished his stroll, thinking about returning home, when he spotted her Alira, standing in front of the pony enclosure. She was alone, transfixed, her entire focus drawn toward a small, snow-white pony on the other side of the fence. His heart gave a small, startled lurch. This wasn't her usual look of innocent curiosity. Her expression was something else entirely intense, reverent, as if she were looking at a creature that held some secret she had been searching for her entire life. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a moment he simply stood there, hidden by the foliage, watching her. He felt an odd mix of jealousy and confusion as she leaned over the fence, reaching out a hand toward the pony's muzzle. The pony took a step forward, drawn to her, and gently nuzzled her outstretched fingers. The way she gazed at the creature, it was a look he recognized, one she had once reserved only for him. It was a look filled with admiration, longing, and something deeper, something primal that seemed to bypass words altogether. As he approached, she didn't turn, still completely absorbed in the pony, her hand moving gently along its muzzle. She was murmuring softly, words in her native language that he couldn't understand but had come to associate with moments of deep affection. It felt as if he were intruding on something private, something meant only for her and this small creature. Finally, he cleared his throat, hoping to break whatever strange spell had taken hold of her. "Alira," he said quietly, trying to keep the confusion and irritation out of his voice. What are you doing here?" She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was a flicker of embarrassment, a flash of guilt, but she quickly turned her gaze back to the pony, her fingers still tangled in its mane. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He took another step forward, feeling the tension between them grow. "I could say the same. You've been distant lately, and now I find you here, staring at a pony." Like he trailed off, unsure how to even put his feelings into words. There was something almost magnetic about the way she was drawn to this creature, as if it possessed a part of her soul he hadn't even known existed. Alira's cheeks flushed a faint, otherworldly shade. The closest her alien complexion came to human embarrassment. She finally let go of the pony's mane and turned fully toward him, though her gaze remained soft, lingering on the creature, as if she couldn't fully tear herself away. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice laced with a hesitation he'd rarely heard before. "There's something about him. Something I can't explain. He feels familiar, like I've known him in some way that I can't put into words." He frowned, struggling to make sense of what she was saying. "Familiar? Alira, he's a pony. How could he be familiar?" She looked down, a small, rueful smile playing on her lips. "I know it sounds strange, but it's more than that. It's like he understands me, like he can see a part of me that no one else has ever seen." She glanced back at the pony, her eyes filled with a quiet longing that made his stomach twist with jealousy and hurt. He was about to respond when he noticed something tucked into her hand, a smartphone, with the screen paused on a video. Curious and wanting to understand this new obsession, he reached out, glancing at the title before he could stop himself. "The horse entered me from behind while no one was watching." The title was shocking, and he felt a jolt of disbelief as he looked at her, his expression a mix of confusion and frustration. "Alira, why are you watching this?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. She glanced at the screen, her expression softening, a strange mixture of embarrassment and fascination flickering across her face. "It's not what it seems," she said quickly, almost defensively. "I was curious. Not in the way you think, but because it made me realize something about connection, about how beings, even those who seem so different, can share something that defies explanation." He took a deep breath, trying to process her words. "You're saying that a video about a horse made you feel this way?" His voice was laced with disbelief. But he couldn't deny the intensity in her gaze, the way she seemed to struggle with emotions that went beyond simple curiosity. Yes, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Watching it, I felt this strange pull, like I understood something about myself, something about what it means to connect with a being beyond words, beyond reason. When I look at this pony, I feel that same pull. It's like he's a part of me, a part one didn't even know I was missing. Her words left him speechless, his mind racing to comprehend what she was saying. The idea of a connection so profound, so inexplicable, between her and this small, innocent creature was absurd. Yet there was something in her eyes, something raw and honest, that told him she believed every word. But what about us, he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and desperation. What does this mean for us? Alira took a deep, shuddering breath, her gaze shifting between him and the pony. I still love you, she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. That hasn't changed. But this bond, it's not something I can ignore. It's as if he's awakened a part of me that's been dormant, a part that only he can reach. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels ancient, like it's been waiting for me. He felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of her confession settling over him like a heavy fog. She was telling him that this bond with the pony was as real to her as anything they shared, that it was something she couldn't simply walk away from. And as much as he wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, he knew, deep down, that she was speaking her truth. So where does that leave us, he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Alira's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her hand resting gently on his. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. All I know is that this feeling, this connection, it's a part of me now. I can't pretend it doesn't exist, even if it means things between us have to change. He looked down at her hand on his, feeling the warmth of her touch, the familiar comfort of her presence, and he realized that he was standing at a crossroads. He could try to fight this, to force her to choose between him and this incomprehensible bond with the pony. Or he could find a way to accept it, to let their love evolve into something that defied logic, something that included this strange, unexpected connection. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of their emotions filling the air around them. He could see the pain in her eyes, the conflict in her heart, and he knew that this wasn't easy for her either. She was torn, caught between her love for him and this new primal bond she couldn't ignore. Finally, he took a deep breath, his voice soft but steady. I don't understand it, he said, his words filled with both sorrow and acceptance. But if this is a part of who you are, then I'll try. I'll try to understand, even if it feels impossible. Alira's face softened, her eyes shining with gratitude as she leaned in, resting her head against his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with a relief that made his heart ache. Thank you for seeing me, for letting me be who I am, even when it doesn't make sense. They stood together in the quiet of the zoo, the pony watching them with a calm, gentle gaze, as if he, too, understood the strange journey they had undertaken. And in that moment he felt a fragile, tentative peace settle over him, a peace that allowed him to embrace the unknown, to accept a love that had become something far beyond his understanding, something boundless and inexplicably beautiful. He stood at a distance, watching Alira as she remained with the pony in an almost trance-like state. Her hand stroked the small creature's mane with a gentleness that seemed reverent, and she murmured in that quiet, melodic tone he recognized from their most intimate moments together. But this time, those words were not meant for him. They were meant for the pony. A sharp pang of jealousy and disbelief tore through him, mingling with the feeling that something deeper, something he couldn't fully understand, was unfolding right in front of him. He took a step forward, hoping she would turn, hoping she would see him and explain that this was nothing, that there was some logical, simple explanation for what he was witnessing. But she remained absorbed, her entire being focused on the creature, as though in this small, innocent pony, she had found something she couldn't find with him. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. Alira, he called, his voice catching in his throat. She looked up, her expression blank at first, as though she were waking from a dream. But then, there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, an emotion he had never seen before. It was both warm and distant, as though part of her were still elsewhere, wrapped up in a place he could not follow. She took a hesitant step back from the pony, her fingers lingering against its mane for just a moment longer before she turned fully to face him. He felt the weight of her gaze, the intensity in her eyes that left him feeling exposed, vulnerable, as though she could see straight through him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the cracks beneath the surface. "Why? Why are you here with him?" She glanced back at the pony, a faint smile curving her lips, a softness in her expression that twisted his heart. "It's hard to explain," she began, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "There's something about him. Something that I feel drawn to. It's like he understands me, like he sees a part of me that I didn't even know existed." He stared at her, feeling the ground shift beneath him as her words sank in. "You're saying that Pony makes you feel more understood than I do?" The words were bitter, laced with disbelief, yet he couldn't deny the sincerity in her gaze, the way she looked at the pony as though he were something sacred. She shook her head, her expression pained, and took a step toward him. "It's not that he makes me feel more understood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's different. When I'm with him, I feel a kind of connection I can't explain. It's like he's reaching into some hidden part of me, a part that's ancient, timeless. I know it sounds strange, but it feels as though he knows me in a way that goes beyond words, beyond anything I can explain." Her words struck him like a physical blow, each syllable cutting through him with a clarity that left him feeling hollow. "Alira, he's just an animal," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "How can you feel something so intense for a creature that can't even speak, that can't possibly understand you the way I do?" She took a deep breath, looking down as though she were trying to gather her thoughts. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with both sorrow and conviction, an emotion so raw that it made his heart ache. "I know it doesn't make sense. I know it sounds absurd. But this feeling, this connection, it's real to me. I can't deny it. When I'm with him, it's like I found a piece of myself that was lost, a part that I didn't even know I was searching for." He felt a wave of anger rise up, a frustration that he couldn't contain. "What about us?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "What does that mean for us? Do I even have a place in your heart anymore, or have you replaced me with him?" Her expression softened and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I still love you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Nothing about that has changed. This connection with the pony, it's different, separate from what we have. But it's as real to me as my love for you. It's not something I can ignore, and I know that's unfair to you, but it's a part of who I am now." He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her confession settle over him like a crushing force. She wasn't just saying she was fond of the pony, she was telling him that her connection with it was something beyond his understanding, something that could never be explained or shared. And he realized, in that moment, that he was standing at a precipice, facing a truth he had never imagined. "So, what am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his heart pounding with the realization that he might lose her to a connection he could never compete with. Her hand tightened on his arm, her gaze pleading, filled with a desperate hope. "I'm not asking you to understand," she whispered. "I know it's impossible. But I'm asking you to accept it, to see that this bond doesn't replace what we have. It's something separate, something that fulfills a part of me that I didn't even know existed." He looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, the depth of emotion that she couldn't contain. And in that moment he understood that this wasn't a choice she had made. It was something beyond her control, something that had taken hold of her heart in a way that defied reason. The realization was shocking, painful, yet he couldn't deny its truth. He took a step back, feeling the full weight of his options pressing down on him. He could walk away, leaving her to this strange, inexplicable bond, or he could stay, accepting a love that had been forever changed. A love that now included an innocent creature that seemed to hold a piece of her soul. In that painful silence, he made his decision, his voice steady, though his heart was breaking. "If this is a part of who you are now," he said quietly, "then I'll try to understand. I'll try to accept it, even if it doesn't make sense to me." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she reached out, pulling him into an embrace, her arms wrapped tightly around him as though she were afraid to let go. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you for seeing me, for letting me be myself, even when it's difficult." They held each other in the quiet of the zoo, the pony watching them with calm, gentle eyes, as though he too, understood the depth of their emotions. And in that moment, he realized that love wasn't always about possession or exclusivity. Sometimes love was about acceptance, about embracing the mystery of another person's heart, even when it led to places he could never follow. And as they stood there, bound together by a love that had been forever changed, he knew that this was a new beginning, a love that included not just each other, but the strange, inexplicable bond she shared with a creature that had somehow become part of their lives, part of their story. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, amber glow over the zoo as he walked along the winding paths, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a terrible, gnawing sadness. The image of Alira with the pony, of the way she had touched it, spoken to it in her soft, reverent tone, it was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake it. He had come here to confront her, to finally demand an explanation he could understand, or at least come to terms with. But as he approached her near the pony enclosure, he found himself hesitating, dreading the answers he knew would only deepen his heartbreak. He watched her from a distance, her figure bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. She was standing close to the fence, her hand resting gently on the pony's neck, her eyes closed as she leaned her forehead against its muzzle. They looked like they were sharing a private moment, a secret exchange that excluded him entirely. It felt like he was watching something sacred, something intimate, and he felt a surge of bitterness, a sharp pang that left him reeling. Finally, he took a step closer, his voice rough, tinged with a rawness he could no longer hide. "Alira." She turned slowly, her eyes opening, widening slightly when she saw him. Her hand remained on the pony, though, her fingers gently tracing the small, soft spot just beneath its ear. "I didn't expect you to come here," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I had to," he replied, swallowing hard as he struggled to keep his emotions in check. "I had to see this for myself. I had to understand what's happening between you and this pony." There was a brief flicker of something in her eyes, guilt, perhaps, or maybe sorrow. She glanced back at the pony, her hand still resting against its mane, as though she couldn't bring herself to let go. "I know this is difficult for you to understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what you think." "Then tell me, Alira," he demanded, his voice trembling. "Tell me what this is. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've replaced me with him." She winced, her hand falling away from the pony as she took a step toward him, her expression pained. "It's not about replacing you," she said, her voice shaking. "This connection I feel with him, it's different. It's something I can't explain. It's like he understands a part of me that's hidden from everyone else, even from you." His heart clenched, and he struggled to keep his composure. "But how, Alira? How can a pony make you feel this way? You're talking about him like he's a person, someone you share your soul with." She took a deep, shuddering breath, looking down as though ashamed, yet unable to deny the truth. "I know it sounds insane," she whispered. "I know it doesn't make any sense. But I can't deny what I feel. When I'm with him, it's like he reaches into the deepest parts of me, parts I didn't even know existed. I feel seen, understood, in a way I can't put into words." Her words felt like a knife twisting in his heart, each syllable cutting deeper, leaving him feeling raw, exposed. "And what about us?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Does this connection mean that I'm not enough for you? That there's a part of you I'll never be able to reach?" Alira's face softened, and she stepped closer, reaching for his hand, her touch warm but trembling. "No, that's not it," she insisted, her eyes filled with tears. "What I feel for you, it's different. It's love, human love. But this bond with him, it's like a part of my soul has been awakened, a part that I didn't even know was there. It doesn't take away from what we have, it exists alongside it." He shook his head, struggling to make sense of her words, to reconcile the woman he loved with the person standing before him now. "You're telling me that you can love me and still feel, whatever this is for him, that there's room in your heart for both of us?" "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not a choice. It's something that's just there, like it's always been a part of me, waiting to be found." He felt a surge of anger, a bitterness he couldn't contain. "Do you have any idea how that makes me feel?" he demanded, his voice shaking. To know that there's a part of you I can never reach, a part that belongs to a creature who can't even speak to you, who can't love you back the way I do. She looked down, her shoulders sagging, her fingers tightening around his. I know it's unfair. I know this is something I never should have asked you to accept. But this connection with him, it's as real to me as my love for you. It's a part of who I am now, and I can't ignore it, even if it means hurting you. He looked at her, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him. She was asking him to accept something that defied logic, that went against everything he thought he understood about love. But as he looked into her tear-filled eyes, he saw the truth. This wasn't something she had chosen. It was something that had chosen her, something that had claimed a part of her heart that he could never touch. Taking a shaky breath, he pulled his hand away, a hollow, aching emptiness settling in his chest. I don't know if I can do this, Alira, he whispered. I don't know if I can share you this way, knowing that part of you will always be with him. Her face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she reached out, her voice pleading. Please, she whispered. Please, I'm begging you to try. This bond doesn't take away from us. It's just another part of who I am. Can't you see that? He looked down, feeling the walls close in, the painful reality of her words settling over him. She wasn't going to choose, couldn't choose, because this connection was as much a part of her as her love for him. And if he wanted to keep her, to stay in her life, he would have to accept this truth, no matter how much it hurt. After a long silence, he finally looked up, his voice hollow. I'll try, he said, the words barely audible. But I don't know if I'll ever fully understand. I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling this. This ache. Alira nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow, and she pulled him into a tight embrace, her arms wrapped around him as though trying to hold him together, to keep him from falling apart. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, the familiar warmth of her presence, and yet, for the first time, he felt a distance, a fracture between them that he didn't know how to heal. They stood there in silence, holding each other in the fading light, the quiet of the zoo surrounding them like a shroud. He knew, in that moment, that their love had changed, had been reshaped into something he could barely recognize. It was no longer just the two of them. It was a love that now included a creature he could never fully understand, a bond he could never touch. And as they held each other, he felt a quiet resignation settle over him, a reluctant acceptance of a love that was no longer his alone, a love that now encompassed something far beyond his understanding. They stood there, facing each other, surrounded by the quiet murmur of the zoo. The air was thick with the weight of words yet unspoken, with truths that had been building between them, pressing down like a storm about to break. He looked into Alira's eyes, searching for the woman he thought he knew, the woman he'd loved with everything he had. But in her gaze, he saw a new depth, something distant and profound, and it both terrified and pained him to his core. Alira, he began, his voice barely a whisper, raw with hurt. How can you say you love me, and then tell me that part of your heart belongs to? She winced, her face softening, her eyes filling with a sorrow that only deepened his anguish. I know it doesn't make sense, she said, her voice trembling. I know I'm asking you to understand something that even I can barely grasp. But this connection, it's not something I chose, it's something that chose me. His jaw clenched, and he felt a surge of bitterness rise up, each word laced with the sharp sting of betrayal. So what am I supposed to do, he demanded, his voice breaking. Just accept that there's a part of you I'll never reach. A part of you that belongs to a pony. She shook her head, looking down as though she couldn't bear to meet his gaze. It's not about choosing between you and him, she whispered. It's not like that. This bond, it's something I didn't even know was possible. It's like he understands something within me, something ancient, something primal. When I'm with him, I feel a peace, a wholeness that I can't explain. His heart twisted painfully, and he struggled to hold back the wave of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. But what about us, he asked, his voice trembling with desperation. Don't we mean anything to you? Don't I mean anything to you? Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her hand trembling as she took his. You mean everything to me, she said, her voice breaking. What I feel for you, it's love. It's human. It's real. But this connection with him, it's like a part of my soul has been awakened, It doesn't replace what we have, it just exists alongside it. He pulled his hand away, feeling a hollow ache settle in his chest, a void that felt endless. I don't understand, Alira, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. How can there be room in your heart for both of us? How can you expect me to share you this way? She closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping, as though the weight of her confession was too much to bear. I know it's not fair to ask, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I know this isn't something you ever expected. But this bond, it's not something I can ignore. It's as much a part of me as my love for you. His hands balled into fists, the pain surging through him like a storm. So what, he asked bitterly, you expect me to just accept that I'll always be second to him? That there's a piece of you I'll never have? She looked up, her gaze filled with both sorrow and resolve. No, she said softly. I'm not asking you to be second. I'm asking you to accept that this bond is a part of who I am now. It's a part of my heart, a part one didn't know was there until I met him. He felt his heart splinter, each word she spoke a blow that left him reeling. And what if I can't accept it, he whispered, the words raw, desperate. What if I can't live with this? Her face crumpled, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Then I'll have to let you go, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Because I can't deny this part of myself, no matter how much it hurts. I love you, but I can't give up this bond. It's a part of who I am now, a part one can't lose. He closed his eyes, the reality of her words crashing over him like a wave. She was telling him, in no uncertain terms, that this connection was non-negotiable, that if he wanted her, he would have to accept her entirely, this new, incomprehensible bond and all. And in that moment, he understood the depth of his choice. He could walk away, leaving her to this strange, unexplainable connection, or he could stay, accepting a love that was forever altered, a love that now included a silent presence he could never touch. With a deep, shuddering breath, he opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. I don't know if I can do this, Alira, he said quietly, his voice breaking. But if loving you means accepting every part of you, even the parts I don't understand, then I'll try. A sob escaped her, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, as though trying to fuse their hearts back together, to bridge the gap between them. He held her, feeling the warmth of her presence, the quiet strength in her embrace, and he knew that this love was both fragile and fierce, a love that had been tested, reshaped by forces he could barely comprehend. As they stood there in the fading light, bound together by a love that defied reason, he felt both the pain of his sacrifice and the strange, bittersweet peace of acceptance. He didn't know what their future would hold, didn't know if he would ever truly make peace with this new reality. But as they held each other in the quiet of the zoo, he understood that love, true love, was as mysterious as it was beautiful, a force that transcended understanding, a bond that could survive even the most impossible trials. They walked slowly out of the zoo, side by side, but wrapped in a silence so dense it felt suffocating. The evening air was heavy, pressing down on him, each step a reminder that he was approaching an impossible decision, one that would alter their lives forever. Alira's gaze was fixed on the ground, her expression distant, as if bracing herself for the words he hadn't yet spoken. And he, too, felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a chasm of uncertainty, wondering if he had the strength to make the leap, or if he'd turn back, abandoning everything they'd built. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. How could he put into words the tumult of emotions swirling inside him? Love, hurt, jealousy, and a sense of betrayal that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He looked over at her, at the alien woman he'd given his heart to, a woman who had once seemed so entirely his. But now a part of her heart belonged to another, someone who couldn't speak, who didn't understand love in the way he did. And yet, he knew, without question, that this bond was as real to her as anything she felt for him. Finally, he stopped, his breath catching as he struggled to find the words. Alira, he began, his voice raw. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can share you. She stopped beside him, her eyes widening, a flicker of pain flashing across her face. I know, she whispered. I know this isn't what you signed up for. And if you can't live with this, I'll understand. Her words cut deep, a mixture of resignation and sorrow that made his heart ache. She was offering him an out, a chance to walk away, to release himself from this burden. But the thought of leaving her, of cutting her out of his life, felt like a wound that would never heal. "But if I stay," he continued, his voice barely audible, "if I try to accept this, I don't know who I'll be anymore. I don't know if I can live with this. This feeling that I'll always be second, that there's a part of you I'll never have." Alira's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, taking his hands in hers, her touch gentle yet trembling. "You're not second," she said, her voice breaking. "This bond with him, it's different. It doesn't replace what we have. It's just something else, something that fulfills a different part of me. But my love for you, my life with you, that's real. That's what I choose every day." He looked down at their intertwined hands, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Part of him wanted to believe her, to accept that their love could exist alongside this other bond, that he could be enough even if he wasn't her only anchor. But another part of him, the part that had always believed in a love that was undivided, felt like it was shattering. "You're asking me to share you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, his pain laid bare. "To accept that there will always be a piece of you that belongs to someone else. I don't know if I can live with that." Alira tightened her grip on his hands, her gaze filled with a desperate hope. "I know it's not fair," she whispered. "And I know this isn't what you wanted. But love, it's not always simple. Sometimes it's messy and confusing, and it asks things of us that we never imagined. But I'm here, right here, because I love you. And I want us to find a way through this together." He closed his eyes, her words echoing in his mind, stirring up a mixture of love and agony. He could feel her presence beside him, her warmth, her sincerity. But he also felt the weight of what she was asking, the sacrifice it demanded, the piece of himself he'd have to surrender if he chose to stay. Taking a deep breath, he opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. "Alira, I don't want to lose you. I love you, and maybe that means I have to learn to love all of you, even the parts that don't make sense to me. Even the parts I can't understand." Her face softened, and a tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Thank you." She leaned in, wrapping her arms around him, holding him close, and he could feel her trembling, the relief and the pain mixing together in their embrace. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, at the crossroads of love, each of them understanding that this choice, this commitment, would forever redefine what they had. He didn't know if he'd find peace with this new reality, or if he'd always carry a lingering ache, a quiet jealousy. But he knew that love, real love, wasn't about possession or control. It was about acceptance, about letting go of what he thought love should be, and opening his heart to something bigger, something that didn't fit into a single definition. As they held each other in the fading light, he felt the smallest glimmer of hope, a tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, their love was strong enough to encompass all of it, to survive even this most unthinkable of trials. And as they walked away together, hand in hand, he knew that they were stepping into a new kind of love, one that defied explanation, yet was, in its own way, beautiful and boundless. The days that followed felt surreal, a strange mix of peace and unease that filled every moment he shared with Alira. He had chosen to stay, to accept the part of her heart that had bonded with the pony in a way that defied all reason. But every time he thought he had come to terms with it, a pang of jealousy or a flash of doubt would remind him of just how uncharted this territory was. One evening, as the sun set in a soft glow over the city, he found Alira in their small garden, sitting on the grass, her back to him, her posture calm and serene. She wasn't alone. Zahor, the white pony that had somehow come to occupy a place in her heart, stood beside her, his muzzle resting gently on her shoulder, his dark eyes calm and knowing. The sight was both beautiful and painful, a vision of harmony that somehow excluded him, leaving him on the outside looking in. He wanted to walk away, to give them the privacy of this strange, unbreakable bond. But Alira turned, sensing his presence, and her eyes softened with an invitation that pulled him forward. She reached out a hand, beckoning him to join them. Hesitantly, he approached, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty in his chest. As he sat beside her, Alira took his hand in hers, her fingers warm and steady. "I know this hasn't been easy," she said softly, her gaze sincere, filled with the same depth he had seen in her when they first fell in love. And I can't thank you enough for trying to understand. He swallowed, nodding slowly, struggling to put his emotions into words. It's strange, Alira, he began, his voice rough with honesty. Every part of me wants to be the only one who holds your heart. But I can see that he's a part of you in a way I can't explain. I feel like I'm sharing you with a piece of the universe I'll never understand. Alira's gaze softened and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, her hand never leaving his. That's the thing about love, she murmured. It's not a single path. It's not something that can be contained. My love for you is whole, real, and nothing changes that. But with Zohar, it's as if he connects me to something timeless, something that I can't reach with anyone else. And you connect me to everything else, to all the life I want to experience, to the future I see us building together. He looked down, letting her words sink in. There was a painful beauty to what she was saying, a bittersweet understanding that love could be more than he had ever imagined. It could be something that didn't fit neatly into human definitions, something that expanded and transformed, embracing connections he would never fully grasp. He reached out, letting his hand brush against Zohar's mane, feeling the rough, solid warmth of the creature beneath his fingers. To his surprise, Zohar didn't pull away. Instead, he remained still, calm, as if accepting the contact as part of this new, shared understanding. It was a moment of silent acknowledgement, a quiet truce between two beings who both loved the same woman in ways that were worlds apart. In that moment, he felt something shift within him, a letting go of the need to possess, to claim every part of her heart. He understood that Alira's love for him was no less real, no less profound, because of her bond with Zohar. It was simply different, a connection that existed in a realm he could never fully enter, but could learn to respect. As they sat together, the three of them under the fading light, he felt an unexpected sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of this new reality. It wasn't what he had imagined love would be, but maybe that was the point. Love, he realized, wasn't about fitting into a mold. It was about expanding, stretching beyond comfort and understanding, embracing the mystery of another person's heart, even when it led to places he could never follow. Alira looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude, with a depth of affection that left him breathless. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet awe. "For seeing me, for letting me be whole, even when it doesn't make sense." He smiled, a genuine, bittersweet smile, and pressed his lips to her forehead. "I don't think I'll ever fully understand it," he admitted, his voice soft. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe love isn't meant to be fully understood. Maybe it's enough to just let it be." And as they held each other in the fading twilight, with Zohar standing beside them, he felt a new kind of love settle over him, a love that was vast, uncontainable, and inexplicably beautiful. It was a love that embraced the unknown, that made space for the strange and the incomprehensible. And though he knew this journey would always come with its share of doubts and struggles, he also knew that he had found something rare, something that transcended understanding, something that was, in its own way, unbreakable. In that moment, surrounded by the gentle silence of the evening, he felt a quiet certainty that this love, however unconventional, was real, powerful, and boundless. And as they watched the stars begin to appear in the sky, he knew that they had stepped into a new chapter, a love that would continue to grow, reshaping itself as they embraced the vast, limitless possibilities of their shared, extraordinary lives.